the sphere through which political stability can be nurtured, can be engendered, or it can be undermined. So when we are talking about economic development and economic cooperation and satisfying the needs and the aspirations of the people, governance is key. And it is important to discuss issues relating to what is the structure of governance, how is performance in the sphere of governance as it affects issues of political stability, issues of economic development, and the issues of actually not just creating growth in economic development, but also the distribution of the benefits of that growth in order to satisfy the needs and aspirations of the people. We have very carefully chosen panelists for this discussion. Professor Pat Utomi is very well known. He's a nationally recognized commentator on public affairs, a brilliant advocate of good governance and of national development, and obviously well chosen to contribute to this discussion. He's not joined us yet, but other members of the panel include Professor Oladipo Ademalokun, my senior colleague in the university system, a professor of public administration, one of the leaders actually who have studied and consulted on matters of governance and the political and economic development of countries all over the world. Professor Ademalokun, you are welcome. I also welcome Alhaji Isa Ahmed, who is a retired permanent secretary in the Kano civil service, a very experienced person, and who I believe in this discussion will bring to bear his experiences and his knowledge about the nature of governance and what we can do to keep on improving this framework of governance, both for political stability, for economic development, and for satisfying the needs and aspirations of the people. The way the panel discussion is structured is that the lead discussant, if he joins us in good time, will speak for 10 minutes, and each of the other discussants will also speak for 10 minutes. But I intend to take some time, since the lead discussant is not around, in order to establish the context for the discussion that we will have on this issue of governance. And if you permit me, I would like to stand up and
Hello.
As a classroom teacher, I feel better when I stand and when I speak. And so to set the context for this discussion, obviously, we would expect to begin with a discussion of what is governance? How can we conceptualize governance? Because it's very important to understand the notion of governance and the different categorizations of governance, ranging from the popular concept that we all know, good governance, to, of course, its clear opposite, bad governance, and a new concept, which I have been a strong advocate of, what I begin to call good democratic governance. So it's important that we address this, and we also then examine the nature of governance in our own country and what can be done to increase the significance and the role and the efficacy of the governance framework for both economic development, for political stability, and also for using the governance framework to address societal needs and aspirations, be it in human security or in the provision of the fundamental needs and aspirations of the people. I think that if we are to define governance, I have found out what, next page please, is somebody handling this? There is what can be considered as a broad definition of governance. That is, the broadest meaning of governance is the production of social order, collective goods, or problem solving through purposeful political and social intervention, either by authoritative decisions, self-governing arrangements. This is a quote from Schneider, and basically it talks about how whether at the level of state institutions or at smaller levels of, say, civil society organizations, governance is very, very important because it relates to the way in which order is established and processes are established and the institutions function in order to address the fundamental needs and the aspirations of the people. But I think when we discuss governance, the concept that seems to be well known is the notion of good governance. Because at a time, particularly in countries such as Nigeria, there was a time when the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF in particular, popularized the notion of good governance. His Highness the Emir of Kano talked about the Washington Consensus, how in the 1980s, the Washington Consensus talked about how countries in the developing world can develop primarily through market reforms, privatization, and related processes, structural adjustment programs, and so on. But obviously, by the late 1980s, it had become clear that trying to develop using that framework of the Washington Consensus really undermined the development capacities of many of these countries. And that was how some scholars, so-called institutional scholars, again associated with the World Bank, began to promote the notion of good governance. And the key question that they posed was that governance and development has to recognize the role of institutions and the capacity of institutions to be able to drive development. And the notion of lean, clean, and efficient governance processes come to the fore. Of course, the fundamental challenge with this notion of good governance is that it's institution-based and is a bit narrow, and therefore, as we reflect on governance in terms of basically bringing efficiency to the institutions of governance, there are clear limitations. So there is a broader notion of governance, and let's move to the next slide, please, which I call an alternative and broader notion of good governance, and that is a notion that is rooted in the basic norms that characterize the system as a whole. And this notion of governance, I believe, is a better alternative because it places premium on the objective interests of citizens, not just a focus on institutions, rather than the narrow interests of the ruling cliques who preside over the governance institutions. And I think that basic norm relates to the question of impartiality in the exercise of public power. Governance is primarily about exercising public power. And if governance institutions and processes are efficient, are effective, but if there is no impartiality in the manner in which those who preside over the governance process conduct themselves, and the institutions of governance also lack capacity to discharge their responsibilities on the basis of impartiality, obviously serious challenges arise. So I think that increasingly in the discussion of governance, it's important to recognize that governance is a framework that should be able to bring about leaner, cleaner, efficient, and effective governance in terms of addressing the fundamental needs and aspirations of the people, but most importantly, it has to do about the basic norm of impartiality in the exercise of public power. And if these basic norms are not there, then it is the basis upon which a lot of bad governance happens in our own context. And can we, next slide please. So while good governance is desirable, both by looking at it as the institutionalist conception, but moderated by the norm of impartiality of governance, it is also important to recognize that governance has to have a democratic context. It has to have a democratic content, particularly under a democratization situation. So in countries such as Nigeria, it is important not only to make government efficient and effective in the provision of public goods, it is not only important to ensure, it is not only sufficient to allow for impartiality in the exercise of public function aspects of public service. All of these are replete with serious challenges. Now, weak and dysfunctional institutions, the challenges of these are further compounded by poor quality leadership. Unfortunately, our transition to the politics of transition to democracy has thrown into the arena of governance people who are inadequately prepared, who are too focused on self-serving objectives, although there are few examples and exemplary cases, but the substantial majority and tendency is that of poor preparation, poor capacity, and promotion of self-serving objectives in the processes of governance. And of course, there is then the acute erosion of value systems, and in particular values such as integrity, such as selflessness, such as selflessness, and a number of other related values are obviously undermined. And that is why corruption flourishes, and the capacity of governmental institutions to deliver on policies, no matter how good they are, is also undermined. Next, please. I have identified what I call the key manifestations of this extreme, the extent and magnitude of bad governance in Nigeria. And what I would want to emphasize in this is, for example, what I call the divergence between the attitude, the mindset, the inclinations, and the actions of most public institutions and the officials who preside over this, and the needs and the expectations and the aspirations of the citizens. And if there is that wide divergence, if what the leaders think is what they do, not taking into account what the expectations and the aspirations of the people are, then obviously the governance process is hijacked, it becomes self-serving, it becomes impartial, and it only generally serves the interests of the ruling clique. So it's very, very important to address this issue of divergence, particularly in a situation of democratization. Elections are supposed to provide the framework through which the members of the executive branch who preside over the governance process and members of the legislative branch are elected. And if they are elected, it is expected that the election that brings them in would make them responsible and responsive to the demands of those who have elected them. But if the electoral process lacks integrity, and if people come into power believing that they bought themselves into power, or they fought themselves into power, or they used whatever, whether it's religion or ethnicity, to come into power, then obviously they underrate, underestimate, and ignore the need to respond to and to be responsible in addressing the needs and the expectations of the people. And there are many other issues that I have mentioned there, including the issue of impunity and the trampling of the rule of law. So I have said all this in order to say that it is very, very important to pursue programs and projects of economic development. It is absolutely necessary in a federal system like ours to forge collaborations, interstate collaborations like what we are seeing in this effort of Lagos and Kano, or even Lagos and Kebbi. But it is also very, very important, if it is to drive economic development and to promote growth in the economy, and also the distribution of that growth to the people, to the citizens of our states and of our country in general. It is very, very important that we reposition the governance process. We keep on improving, strengthening the processes of governance, taking more of the aspects of good governance, and indeed improving upon what I call the democratic content of governance. Of course, I'm not going to go into all this because I would have taken all the time, but I have done this because the primary discussant is not here, and therefore I'm taking the liberty of that to discuss this. I expect that in the discussion we will address the issue of what are the root causes of bad governance in our own country. And having identified these root causes, then what can we do, whether in the short, in the medium, and in the long term, in order to address the framework of governance, to improve its quality, and to ensure that it is not only amenable to efficient and effective governance process, but also it can open up opportunities for economic growth, for strengthening stability of the system, minimizing conflicts, and therefore creating a legitimate basis for continuous growth and development of our countries. So I'm sure we'll come to address all of these issues from the contributions of the discussants on, for example, are there still legacies of colonialism? And there are some scholars who still think that in our governance process today, 60 years or more after being independent, you can still identify what they call legacies of colonialism, whether in the setting up of the public service structure and the processes, and that some of these legacies are actually undermining or obstructing the capacity and the efficacy of governance in our country. There are also talks about the legacies of military rule or in other executive positions. What can be done in order to address this crisis of mediocrity in governance? How can we improve the integrity of the electoral process so that it can keep on helping sanitize politics and improve the recruitment process into the governance process? These are very, very important issues that we have to pay attention to. So which of these has the most significant aspect, or what combination of these have significant aspect? Or are there other issues which we think actually impact on governance and push us in this direction of bad governance rather than good governance or good democratic governance? So these are some of the issues that I have identified, which I think we should be able to discuss in this process. But most significantly, I don't think it is in doubt that if the governance process is bad, then it undermines the legitimacy of regimes, it creates and nurtures instability and conflicts and crises, and it also undermines the foundations of sustainable economic development processes. And of course, once all of these are undermined, it means that the satisfaction of the needs and the aspirations of people through the governance process is also undermined. So there is clearly a relationship, associational or correlational, between good governance or good democratic governance and political stability and also economic development. So in our own terrible situation, I must say terrible compared, of course, to a number of other countries, a situation of governance, what can we do to minimize these extreme tendencies of poor quality governance in order to create the grounds for better quality governance, what I call good democratic governance, and be able to address the challenges of development and the stability in our country. So I hope I have set the context for the discussion. We will take the two discussants who are here and open the discussion to the floor. Each one of them will take 10 minutes to also share with us their perspectives on this question of governance and what we can do to strengthen the capacity of governance in order to promote stability rather than instability, and in order to create the foundation for sustainable economic growth rather than economic crisis. So I will begin by inviting Professor Ademalokun, somebody who has, as a professor of public administration and also a consultant on governance for the World Bank for a very long time, to share his own perspectives and experiences on this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm standing because I've been sitting for some hours, so it's good to have this difference. Although, as he said, we are all teachers. I will simply elaborate on some aspects of what the moderator has said, and the definition of governance that I will give is to identify the key elements of governance. Some of them will overlap, predictably, with what the moderator said. And the 6 common elements of governance in the literature that I'm going to focus on are the following. One is the rule of law that is assured by an independent judiciary that interprets and applies the law and puts constraints on the exercise of executive power, enforces property rights and contracts, and helps to ensure respect for human rights. A second element of governance that is commonly cited, which the moderator mentioned, is electoral legitimacy, meaning reliance on establishing governments through periodic free and fair elections. Given his pedigree, I think we take all that he has said about the need for credibility of the electoral process seriously. Next is civil liberties, including human rights, freedom of expression, association, and other human rights. The next one is state capability, meaning a well-functioning public service. It's absolutely right that without a public service with the expertise and professionalism to deliver, you cannot have good governance. So that's a key element of governance. And next is accountability and transparency, assured, for instance, by such measures as freedom of information and ombudsman-like institutions. And finally, the corruption level. Low-level corruption is good governance. High-level corruption, like we have in Nigeria, as he calls it, is bad governance. That's a very clear example. What I have done against the background of these elements of governance is to borrow a framework. I won't bother you with the authors, but it's a framework which I acknowledge in the paper that I will make available to the organizers. The framework claims that, according to the framework, you have political inclusion when those elements of governance are present. And political inclusion tends to create economic inclusion. And when you combine political inclusion with economic inclusion, you move in the direction of economic growth and prosperity. That book details out, or those authors detail out, countries with those experiences, and I won't bother you with all of them. But specific examples they gave include, for instance, the example of rule of law that ensures the protection of property rights and the enforcement of contracts, which are crucial for well-functioning markets. Now, you need well-functioning markets in order to have a good economy. State has an important role through the public service we've just mentioned, but markets have to function properly. They also give examples of how inclusive economic and political institutions will be widely resisted through free media. Free media helps to resist attacks on economic and political inclusion. The opposite, of course, is extractive economic and political institutions. The countries they cited, the one I will focus on is an African country. We may not all be familiar with it, but we know of it, Botswana. Botswana is a country of political inclusion plus economic inclusion, and that has enjoyed rapid economic development. I will just cite an example. In 2008, Botswana was cited as one of 13 countries in the whole world that had 7% economic growth over 25 years during the second half of the 20th century. Today, that is in 2017 Transparency International corruption level, Botswana is the least corrupt African country, scoring 61% and 34th cleanest country in the world. I'm sure you can compare with our situation, 148th in the world, and we scored 27 out of 100. So the result is that when you lack political inclusion plus economic inclusion that leads to this kind of growth and prosperity, part of the explanation is your level of corruption. And there is consistency between our two countries. What I will read to you confirms what the moderator just said, something I wrote recently about the challenge, or if you like, the reason why there is more extractive political and economic institutions in Nigeria. And this is the way I put it. The centralized federal system under military rule for close to 3 decades, from 1966 onwards, was characterized by the concentration of power and resources at the center through military fiat. And the inclusive aspects of the political and economic institutions they inherited were progressively abandoned as successive military rulers exercised power without constraints. Political parties and elected assemblies were proscribed. Military diktats were superior to the rule of law. There was progressive decline in the performance of public services, and corruption became institutionalized. Although there was noticeable economic growth, spurred largely by oil and gas, it was essentially a case of growth without development, as there was an increase in poverty level in Nigeria, estimated at about 65%, compared to 25% in the mid-1960s, that is before the military came. The maintenance of a centralized federal system in the constitution that ushered in civilian rule in 1999 has meant that the country's political and economic institutions have remained in the extractive trajectory. Power and resources remain concentrated at the center, as was the case under the pre-1999 arrangements. The limited legislative powers for the subnational assemblies have been maintained since 1999. Real movement towards political institutions that have extractive characteristics have endured, notably a weak judiciary, weak public service institutions, high-level corruption. Today, poverty level in the country is estimated at 70%. What I want to do against the background of contrasting Botswana and Nigeria is to look at 4 experiences of Kano and Lagos State very, very briefly. The first that I pick on is how the two states are focusing or are tackling the issue of electoral legitimacy. Both states have conducted local government elections, which is ensuring that accountability gets down to the local level. The issue there now is the credibility of those elections. The two states will need to pay attention to the credibility of the local government elections. However, the usefulness of local government elections is that accountability at the local level is more direct at the grassroots level. The second example that I take is peace and security. Political instability or political stability you get by having peace and security. In Lagos State, Lagos has established the Lagos Neighborhood Safety Corps, which in fact is a precursor of state police, and is something that Kano State might look at. Third, anti-corruption agency in Kano State. It is not because Kano is the most corrupt of the 36 states. It is because Kano is aware of the negative consequences of corruption for the economy and even for society. And I think it's a good step. The fact that Adamawa State recently copied the example of Kano suggests that there is some good practice there, which Lagos may also want to look at. Finally, I look at language and citizen participation in politics and economic development in Lagos State. The recent law on the preservation and promotion of Yoruba in Lagos State, people look at it in different ways, but in the context of our governance discussion, the emphasis I want to lay is that the examples of Korea, Japan, and China show the extent to which indigenous language can help invention and innovation. If this law in Lagos is faithfully implemented and moves in that direction, then there will be positive result from that law. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ademalakun, for sharing your own perspectives and emphasizing some of the very important issues which help bring about good governance. Strengthening the judiciary, tackling corruption, addressing the rule of law, and reforming the public service. And thank you also for drawing our attention to some examples of countries that have developed because they have taken measures to bring corruption to the barest minimum, and they have respected the rule of law. They've strengthened their institutions, and you've mentioned Botswana, which has been a shining example in relative terms in the African continent. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been joined now by Professor Pat Otomi, our lead discussant. I'm sure he must have been unavoidably held up. Now that he's here, I think I would like to invite him to make his presentation as the lead discussant before we continue with the discussions. You have 10 minutes. You know how these things are regulated. Yes, you're welcome.
Moderator, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, first let me begin by apologizing. I knew I was going to be running late and I sent word ahead. Actually, I've just come from a program that I myself was moderating, looking at a similar subject, honoring the contributions of General Theophilus Yakubu Danjuma through the work that he has done in social philanthropy, strategic philanthropy. And so I dashed out immediately. It was finished and started coming here. So my apologies for arriving late. But nothing could give me greater pleasure than to be part of this discussion, because in many ways I'm a child of both Kano and Lagos. As the moderator probably knows from my visit to him many years ago, I actually started school in Kano. in 1960 at St. Thomas Primary School in Kano, and therefore have part of the Kano heritage. And for most of my adult life, I have lived in Lagos, and I'm enormously proud to say I'm a Lagosian. There are many lessons for governance that I think are important for us to, if you will, present here. Principally because of my own development as an academic, as an entrepreneur, as a participant in the evolution of the social sector. It has allowed me the privilege of being enormously active in the development process on at least 3 continents. And I would like to be able to draw from some of these experiences to engage challenges and lessons that we must draw both in Lagos and Kano. But principally, I'm excited about this process because we have to begin to see that we can learn from each other. Part of the reason that we have uneven development in Nigeria is that we have not learned to learn from each other, because there is a pool of experience around our country that can help us make very quick progress. In terms of how my own academic career and governance and development have evolved, as a graduate student in the 1970s, I was fascinated by the challenges of development in Latin America. I was particularly fascinated by the work of an Argentine academic who offered us some model of why development could be taking place faster in some enclaves. Guillermo O'Donnell and his bureaucratic authoritarian thesis, which came out of work in Latin America, focused my attention and my interest, and in fact influenced my PhD thesis in terms of coalitions for development. His ideas were essentially about technocratic coalitions of public service and political class. In Latin America at that time, they were so-called modernizing coalitions from the military and the higher bureaucracy, technocracy, if you will. I tried to test in Nigeria if the relationship between the political class and the bureaucratic class that is excluding but focused on development was present, and if this could drive development in Nigeria. I don't have the time to go into outcomes of my thinking about that. My interest in Latin America began to wane as a number of Asian economies surged forward, and I switched my research interests from Latin America to Southeast Asia sometime during the course of the 80s. And it is really fascinating for me to see what made the difference in Southeast Asia. Indeed, one of my, if you will, consuming passions is comparing Nigeria with a number of select Southeast Asian economies, principally, of course, Indonesia. Indeed, a friend of mine, Peter Lewis, who was a young graduate student after I had left, eventually wrote a book titled Growing Apart, which is a comparison of how Nigeria and Indonesia went different paths. Because back in the 60s, people used to say to Indonesia, we wish you could be like Nigeria. But by the 1990s, they were saying to Nigeria, we wish you could be like Indonesia. The question is, what went wrong? What changed the trajectory of the development of our economies? What can we learn from what the Asians did wrong? To just put it in graphic form, one great son of Lagos, the now late Chief Rashid Badamosi, when he was Minister for Economic Planning, was head of Nigeria's delegation to OPEC. And so they got to this OPEC meeting, if you remember 1998, when oil prices were down to below $10. And everybody was scrambling for quota. And they were struggling who would get more quota so that they could get some more revenues. He said he sat at the meeting and he looked at the Indonesian oil minister who was paying no attention to the scramble. He was doodling. And so he wondered what was going on. So at the break, he went to the Indonesian oil minister and said to him, "What is the matter with you? Are you not interested in more quota?" Said, I looked at him. He said, it's you Nigerians who are not serious. He said, in Indonesia, we're not concerned about crude oil quotas. Most of our revenue is now coming from gas. And you Nigerians were in a better position than us with gas. And Rashid Banamoshi said he shouted, "Part!" because he immediately remembered the many conversations he and I had had on the subject. And as he landed in Lagos, the first thing he did was call me. Part of our problem in Nigeria is that we have not created a developmental state orientation. The trouble of Nigeria is politics is the death of Nigeria. We have become consumed by politics. Extreme partisanship when it is partisanship, extreme this, extreme that, ethnicity, extreme that, extreme, when we should be concerned about human development, a developmental state focused on the well-being of the people. And this is what led Indonesia to the position that it got to when Nigeria began to discuss LNG. Indonesia was nowhere on the map, but Nigeria was still quarreling, playing politics with the first LNG train when Indonesia got to its 7th train. And we're struggling for crude quotas when Indonesia was earning so much revenues from gas. That is just a simple example of where that is coming. But because time is so limited, let me jump to a framework that I've used to analyze these matters over the years. You know, in 1999, I was invited by Jeffrey Sachs to work with him on the first Africa Competitiveness Report. That report was presented at the World Economic Forum in Durban in the year 2000. At the presentation of that report, the president of Mozambique, you know, after Jeff's presentation, said, "You experts have come again. You tell us to do this, that if we do it, investments will increase and we will make progress. We do it, we don't see any investors. Now you're giving us another set of criteria. World Bank, tell us what happened the last time." I mean, he was very humorous, everybody laughed. But the World Bank vice president said, you know, the problem is that, you know, people need to see a track record. People need to, after all the laughing, I did not find it funny. Because for me, what was at stake was the lives of African peoples, the quality of life they lived, which was responsible for all the civil wars and all the Afro-pessimism that had arisen around the world. What can we do to make real progress happen? I went back to my hotel room and I could not sleep. But by the time it was 6 a.m., I had sketched a framework, which I came to call the Growth Drivers Framework. These, for me, were the critical soft issues that were responsible for sustained development. That framework became the basis of a book I wrote in 1996 titled Why Nations Are Poor. It's interesting that Robinson Acemoglu, years later, in fact 10 years later, would write the now famous Why Nations Fail, based on the same very concepts that I offered 10 years before in the book Why Nations Are Poor. How did we get to where we were, in my view? A number of variables are critical for real development to take place. And they are interdependent, affect each other. One was the one that was dominant in discussion at the time. Is it policy that's responsible for progress? Or is it destiny or other factors? Two major schools in economics were arguing about why development was slow in countries like Nigeria. One side was dominated by the person I mentioned earlier that I worked with on the Africa Competitiveness Report, Jeffrey Sachs. And that was often referred to as the geography argument or the destiny argument, which looked at environmental factors that retarded development. Oh, Africa is in the tropics. Because Africa is in the tropics, people have malaria all the time. And because they have malaria, they are not able to produce. This is part of Jeff's thesis, which I disagree with completely. On the other hand, Paul Collier from Oxford argued that Africa was not making progress because African leaders were making the wrong policy choices. I agreed more with Paul Collier than I agreed with Jeff Sachs, but each has an element. Anyway, the policy question was the central issue in development at that time. That's what the president of Mozambique, Mozambique was arguing about in that World Economic Forum. But I made the point that when Africa leaders finally make the right policy choices, those policies don't move them to where they should go, because you can make the right policy and weak institutions lead to a pushback. I don't have the time, but I can give you 100 illustrations of good policies we have made in this country that weak institutions, like the central bank, push us back on. Now, so institutions have to be a major thing. How do we build institutions? Again, I don't have the time, but to understand institutions and how they evolve, one of the most important discussions and contributions to this was by a gentleman called Douglas North. Dougie North died a couple of years ago, but he won the Nobel Prize more than 15, 20 years ago in economics. He's essentially an economic historian, and his book, 1990 book, Institutions, Institutional Change and Economic Performance, is the best discussion that I know of on institutional economics and how institutions affect development. In 1996, I spent a year of sabbatical at the Harvard Business School. I went to spend a little time at Stanford, invited by Larry Diamond to the Hoover Institution, and Dougie North was spending sabbatical leave there. Some very interesting conversations we had about institutions and how they impact development. Now, so if institutions matter, what else matters? Human capital. Today, we talk about the youth bulge in Africa. Some people are afraid of what the youth bulge, our population growth, will cause. But the truth of the matter is that our youth bulge, as China and India have managed to prove, can become actually an advantage. We can reap a demographic dividend. And what it takes is to invest massively in developing these young people so that they become a productive force that drives economic development. The Japans of this world are now suffering because they do not have the population. The people are aging. The population is not there. We have that advantage. Let us invest in these young people, education, healthcare, and we'll be able to compete. Fourth variable is entrepreneurship. How do we create a culture of entrepreneurship? Now, one of the things I've spent most of the last 20 years of my life doing is to facilitate a culture of entrepreneurship being generated. Young people not looking for any job, but looking for how to create opportunities for others. And it's a culture thing. We have to create a culture of entrepreneurship. We have to create incentive systems. One of the best conversations, again, on this subject, because I don't have the time, is to go to a book that was written some 15 or so years ago by two University of Chicago graduate school professors, one of who went on to become chief economist at the IMF, and then the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Raghu Rajan. Raghuram Rajan and his colleague at the University of Chicago, Luigi Zingales, wrote a most interesting book titled Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. It talks about how the biggest problems for capitalist advance are currently successful capitalists. Like my friend, Rabiu Ishaku Rabiu here, he's dangerous to the advance of young entrepreneurs because he doesn't want them to overtake him. So his business is to block them. Aliko, block those boys. The system, therefore, must create possibilities for younger people, 21-year-old people who don't have money, who don't have power, who don't sit down with governors to have conversations, to be able to tackle Rabiu in business. And that is called creative destruction. To build a culture of creative destruction takes a mindset, both in academia, and one of the things that I enjoy doing is that in the last couple of years, NUC executive secretaries have invited me to UC to give workshops for vice chancellors on how to introduce entrepreneurship thinking into the academic curriculum in Nigerian universities. And I think that is a very important thing for us to do, to change the mindset and to change the way we engage. Now, if we have a culture of entrepreneurship, we have all of this. What else is critical for human progress? Our value system. Nigeria is a country held hostage by a collapse of culture. Our values determine the kind of progress that we can make. A couple of years ago, while I was on that sabbatical leave, there was a colloquium at Harvard titled How Values Shape Human Progress. Now, that colloquium was essentially driven by the ideas of a former Harvard professor who became a politician, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Daniel Patrick Moynihan essentially in one of his, if you will, contributions, talks about the two truths, that there are two fundamental truths in how politicians think in America. Conservatives, liberals. And it goes like this. It says that the central conservative truth is that it is not politics, but culture that is responsible for the progress of a society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself. So liberals believe that you can use politics to do social engineering. In changing the culture of the people, you can take them from where they were, which was backward, to where they should be, which is a lot of progress. And at the late, okay, so I'll leave his name alone. From Harvard makes the point that the best example is the Singapore story, where one man, Lee Kuan Yew, used politics to take the culture of a people, change it, and in changing it, literally, took that country in one generation from third world to the first. So, what is the important role of leaders? And I think this is so important for me to make this point here. In Nigeria, I'm always upset when they say, that governor tarred a road. Tarred a road from here to there. What's he supposed to do? Not tar roads. He tarred a road, that's good. Anybody can sign a check for Julius Berger to go and tar a road. What governors do that is important is that they shape culture. When that road is being tarred, it's the governor that will ensure that everybody knows that a road of this nature, if the population between Ekpe and Lagos is growing at this rate, that road will need to be expanded within 5 years. If you tar this kind of road, you need to maintain it at a certain level. That's what leaders do. They shape culture, which then sustains progress. Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, Lagos-Benin Expressway. When I came back after my PhD in 1982, I went from Lagos to Benin, toll gate to toll gate, 2 hours, 40 minutes. When Desiani Alise Madueke was Minister of Transport, she went to cry there because it took 2 days to make that trip that took me 2 hours, 40 minutes to make in 1982. It shows that whereas we have tarred roads, we didn't show leadership that would make those roads sustainable. And that is what leaders do. And whatever we do, we must realize that until leadership can help us deal with these factors, we cannot make the progress that we must make. And that is why I would say study Lagos very clearly, very closely, because I see Lagos, and I take pride in being one of those who did work in the early days of the new Lagos. I see Lagos taking some of these issues. At those quarterly retreats we used to have with the governor and his cabinet in the early 2000s, I pushed these factors so hard that I once teased the then governor, Ashwaji Bola Ahmed Tinubu. I said to him, look, go and read Lee Kuan Yew's From Third World to the First. Read it either for your learning or for punishment. Whichever one it does to you, but read it. And one day he waved the book to me, say, I'm reading it, I'm reading it. And I can see in what has happened in Lagos some of the effects of those retreats. I thank you for allowing me to speak on this matter, and we'll talk through it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Patu Tomi. Please join me in giving him another round of applause. Thank you very much. And you've raised quite a number of important issues about development. And obviously, leadership is critical. Leadership choices are important. And what policies they choose and how they pursue them is also very important. Institutions do matter, but change of culture it's also very, very important. We will come back to some of these issues and how a good governance framework can actually help in do all of these issues. So last but not least, I would like to invite Alhaji Isa Ahmed to also contribute his own perspective to this discussion. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. So when professors spoke standing, who am I? And what I'm going to say also involves leveraging. So I deliberately leveraged on the knowledge of the professors to set the theoretical framework so that I can come and lay the applied perspective. And I always, in my paper, canvass for a necessary transition from theory to practice. And in doing so, I will try to draw a kind of comparative advantage between Kano and Lagos, because whatever have been said about good governance deals much about the theory, the theoretical aspect. And I have seen perspective raised from the cultural one to the democratic perspective and to the shared perspective by Professor Adamalakum. And interestingly, they have all been my teachers in life. So standing before you, sir, I am protected. I enjoy the immunity of making errors, knowing fully well that I'm going to be corrected. I'm not going to dwell very much on the theoretical perspective that has been ably dealt with by the eminent presenters. The objective of my paper is simply to identify, using Kano and Lagos as reference point, the correlation between political stability and good governance, and to establish, if any, the relationship between good governance and economic development, identify best practices and processes in the two states for possible adoption, and also identify challenges and propose possible solutions. But time will not permit me to give this elaborate detail, most of which were raised by the moderator. So I will quickly go into the comparative analysis between Kano and Lagos. But before doing so, I want to say, sir, Professor Jega has raised the perspective of democracy in terms of a precondition for economic development or for good governance. And I say, no, it's not an abiding norm. Why did I say so? I just want to draw from example from some three contexts: the international context, and then the national context and subnational context. From the international environment, I want to quickly recall, sir, I'm sure you will agree with me, the Meiji era of Japan in 1867 and 68, and how human rights, as advanced by Professor Adamaloku, were trampled upon, but with a sole purpose of setting that country on the path of development and creating sustainability. So without democracy, without human rights, yes, the Meiji model has succeeded, and Japan today is among the most developed nations in the world. The Chinese too, you remember in the 70s and 80s, America will always list China as the leading country in the, for lack of respect of human rights. And they were telling them to open their gates. And you remember when Chinese were seen on the boat together with the Vietnamese, just like Africans have been seen across the Mediterranean. And they were being supported housed in Australia as a sort of humanitarian gesture. But when China finished its own revolution and opened the gate, and now we are crying that China is trying to take over the world economy. Even the West and America are no longer happy with the Chinese model because China is becoming a serious threat. Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia in 1981 to 2003 used the democratic model but did not respect human rights. He did not respect the value system. He, in fact, ensured that he did not respect the rule of law, but he did it with impunity to set Malaysia on the path of progress. Why is Malaysia today? Malaysia has transformed from a relatively third world country into a leading economy. So this is my paradigm. As a national environment, I just want to take us, because Professor has raised the perspective of colonialism. But I say colonialism has a role. It was there to serve the colonial interests. Therefore, it set an agenda and vision that served its existence. The amalgamation, the administration, remember when they amalgamated Nigeria in 1914, there were no infrastructure, nothing, no challenges. But His Excellency said a railroad was built from Lagos to Kano between 1903 when Kano fell and 1912. There was a rail line 1,000 kilometers linking Kano and Lagos corridor to evacuate what? Raw materials for the colonial economy. But we missed one point. It took the colonial administration only 10 years to build 1,000 kilometers of railroad from Lagos to Kano when there were no roads. And those rail elements and all the surveys were done physically by manpower. Now it's taking us 100 years to rehabilitate the same rail from Lagos to Kano. So what are we saying? The problem is embedded in us. During the military era, the corporations were functioning. Railways was functioning. The airways were functioning. So the economy was moving. And there was some degree of human security under the military rule, despite the fact that it trampled upon the rights. What we missed is that the military did not use the advantage of coercion to establish framework for national identity. That was the greatest problem. So that is my take. Now, let me come to the subnational level. When Kano was created on May 27, 1967, it was created the same day with Lagos. But I'm taking the Kano as a subnational example. When Kano was excised, was created out of the then northern Nigeria, the late governor, Audu Bako, who was not an indigenous of Kano, he hailed from Sokoto. When his peers from the other 6 northern states, new northern states, were navigating for their ways, Audu Bako simply took the plan generated by the then northern Nigerian government and commenced action, while others were navigating their ways. So I'm coming to this. What I'm saying, plan and vision are essential to making an inroad. Now, for us to compare Lagos and Kano, I just want to use my elementary arithmetic. So I took the lower common factors. What are the lower common factors? We have mentioned population. We have mentioned there are politically enlightened communities. Really, 2 decades of uninterrupted democratic rule. Kano had enjoyed between 1999 to date. Reliance on statutory federation allocation. Even though Lagos State has provided figures in here and there to show that they are progressively moving out of reliance into autonomy, but there is much to be desired. There is a budget of 1 trillion when I look at the Lagos platform this morning, which is going to be funded from an internally generated revenue base of about 280 or so billion, which means there is a deficit of about 600 or 700 million, which is to be filled either by private sector or by the federation account. It's a good thing Lagos is doing, moving from point A to B, but that is also a lower common factor between Kano and Lagos. There is a passion for renewal. Of course, nobody can deny it. There is a passion for renewal in Kano, there is a passion for renewal in Lagos and transformation. They are all positively disposed reforms and partnership. And this partnership that is being built between Kano and Lagos and Ogun State, Lagos and Kebbi is a good thing. And they are positively, also there is incremental reforms to the improvement of the electoral process, particularly for the state government election, which is being conducted by INEC. We have seen the federal government determination to do that. But there is certainly a deficit at the lower level of electoral process, which is a national malady, as raised by Professor Adam Malakun. So also Professor Atomi has raised the issue of managing mindset, which is a huge challenge between Kano and Jigawa. Mindset in 2 ways. In Kano, environment, government always generates the impression that it can provide free services for everything. And the citizens alike want to take everything for free. So it's a mindset either way. So once we tell the electorate that we are going to give them everything for free, education free, water free, everything free, then that government cannot do that. We don't have the resources to do that. We have to begin a process of changing the mindset. I'm coming to it. What is the national the operating environment in the 2 states? Lagos has far greater advantages than Kano. It has been an all-administrative capital. It is the nation industrial and business capital hub. Certainly, no doubt about it. It's a highly urbanized state. They have little challenges of rural-urban divide, even though it has its own challenges. High literacy level, certainly no dispute. When you compare Kano and Lagos, if you want to be sincere to learning process, there is higher literacy level between Kano and Lagos. It has a robust economy, and the Atlantic corridor has conferred on Lagos far advantages in terms of port services, industries, and other opportunities. And 2 decades of one-party rule. What I mean by one-party rule, it has been AD, from AD to APC, to ACN, from ACN to APC, and shared orientation between the governors. This is what is lost in Kano. There has been a lot of interruption. So Kano is a largely agrarian economy, a major national and regional commercial center, as has been ably said by other presenters in the morning, but it has lower literacy level, low industrialization. So most of the industries have closed. I've seen the district head of Topa making case for the resuscitation of ailing industries. The industries of Kano have closed. The only ones that are operating now are those that are marginally related with agriculture, with the rural economy. All others maybe were soft industries set up for some specific purposes. It has narrow tax base, the high incidence of poverty. Poverty in Kano is about 56, adult poverty is about 56.5, while compared to that of Lagos, which is 23%. So when you take this into when you compare these two corridors, you find that Lagos has far better advantage in terms of taxable adults or taxable sources of income, because you cannot tax a 56% that is abjectly poor compared to Lagos 23%. What are the approaches then? I'm looking at the approaches to development. I am taking the case of Lagos. Lagos has adopted long-term planning. I was here 16 years ago as civil servant to study what Lagos was doing under Governor, His Excellency Governor Tinubu. And we went back to start our own program. So Lagos has focused on appraisal and incremental implementation of those plans bequeathed by Tinubu. And as Professor Utomi aptly said, they have been doing that. We have also been organizing retreats to build capacity towards adopting our own plans. Community sensitization and enlightenment and institutional reforms, which Kano was also doing, and optimizing latent and manifest issues. Quickly, because of time, I just want to leave that and look at Kano's approach. Kano's approach to development is two frequent changes of development plans from 1999 to date. From my own understanding of the operation of government, there was K-seats and leads, which was a development plan abstracted from the national needs plan. It was transformed into KSRD under Shekarau administration with 16 thematic areas. That was bequeathed to Governor Konkoso, who renamed it and reviewed the 16 thematic areas to 14 and renamed it KSDP. And now I understand the same development plan is being reviewed. So I begin to ask, what are we reviewing when we have not started implementing in earnest? Because in between the period of the review and the implementation, governance continues, and we have to have a vision. This has led to delayed implementation of draft plans a decade almost over. So we cannot continue to be at the drafting stage years and years and years, and time is resource. Varying perspective and loosely connected initiatives and blood vision. Of course, I have seen this morning some clip about Kano, and it is interesting. But this morning before I come to this venue, I visited the site of Lagos State, and it was rich. I look at the Ministry of Health, I look at the indices year after year after year after year. It is there. Or looking at the Kano's platform, you do not see what you saw this morning. Then what are we doing? Why can't we tell our own story? So this is a huge deficit. We need to invest in technology to ensure that we tell our own story. Lagos is doing that, Kano is not doing that, sincerely speaking. Institutional reforms, legislative, bureaucratic, and judicial. This is what has been highlighted, and we must have to do that. Societal integration of Sharia, modern governance, and others. This is what Kano has been doing. We integrated Sharia. In fact, when we started Sharia, people thought it was about cutting the hand. No, it's much more than that. There was a Hizbah, like it was raised by Professor Ademoloku, a Hizbah which was akin to what Lagos did, but established and doing a fine job in moral awakening and moral orientation. Zakat and the Hubusi Commission are to ensure that inclusion is facilitated for those that are the vulnerable groups out of the transformation measures. So it's one other option which Lagos should consider. The multi-door system, multi-door court system initiative was born out of Zoran Sulhu, means of settling social conflict and tensions and disagreement. And today, it is helping improve social justice and peace initiative in Kano. Annual retreats, of course, they are there. So what I'm saying, the aggregate effect of all these things is that for Lagos, the ease of doing business in state-of-state assessment was 28 days in 2018. But as for Kano, it's 40 days. So the ease of doing business in Lagos is 28 days. And that of Lagos is 28 days, and that of Kano is 40 days. So those involved should look at this and see how we can reduce the time for ease of doing business, because others that are going to invest will want to come to Lagos where you spend 28 days rather than Kano where you spend 80 days. What are the key lessons learned out of this? Economic development and political stability, or political development and good governance are organically linked. And then shared vision, achievable goals, and behavioral targets are essential to sustainable growth. And quickly, education is a prerequisite to development. We must invest in quality education. Without that, we should forget about that. Sustained and effective mobilization of citizens, political bureaucratic elites are necessary to engender public support, ownership, and participation. Physical infrastructural renewal and improvement alone are not synonymous to development. We must make the distinction. Physical infrastructure and renewal are not synonymous with development. It must entail inclusion. If people are excluded, then it means it is not sustainable. 23% of Lagosians are excluded. 56% of Kano State citizens are excluded, which means it is not sustainable. There are some key, Mr. Chairman, I just want to take 2 minutes to just read quickly the recommendation, because we cannot meet here without recommendation. I want to provide some quick recommendations. Comments in the case of Kano State and the focus on implementation of revised plans. Kano State must, arising from this conference, begin the implementation of whatever plan it has and start afresh. Revised plan in the case of Kano should, as much as possible, aim at transiting the existing rural agrarian economy to a modern technology-based industrial variant. Encourage and assist respective local government councils to adopt long-term planning to foster growth and development as a grassroots. Because the case of Kano is, apart from Kano, the remaining 36 local governments are rural local governments. So if development is centered at Kano alone, then you are creating islands. Develop human capital through quality education and entrepreneurship, like Professor said, skills, acquisition to enhance individual income, well-being, and expand the tax net. You cannot tax people without enhancing their capacity to earn income. Build strong sense of community and national identity through massive and sustained orientation program to assist development pursuit. Kano has Adedi Sau, and Adedi Sau is a homegrown initiative born out of the Sharia. Should be looked into and expanded to ensure that the platform of credible data on government and endeavors that is regularly updated and accessed by the public is necessary. Peer review, as is being done between Kano and Lagos at occasion, it has been suggested, must be carried. We have to deepen participatory democracy through further reforms in the electoral process, most especially in local government elections, to increase transparency and raise public confidence in political process. This applies to both Kano and Lagos. And we must collect, study, and where relevant, in the case of Kano, and declassify numerous reports and research works lying fallow in the Executive Council Secretariat. When you go to Kano State Executive Council Secretariat, there are documents from Northern Nigerian government that can contribute to to realize the development vision of Kano, that are lying fallow are not accessed. We should commence a process of declassifying those reports and making them public or integrating them into our own vision. Thirdly, that has to be done. Collaboration with our universities and other tertiary institutions in the areas of research and adaptive technology. We have to promote creativity also through the medium of annual innovation and innovation in technology fair. If we can do this, there are very many people out there in Kano who can, they have not gone to formal school, but they can create avenues. We have to also leverage on the effort of others. Leveraging, I have just leveraged on the effort of the professors, 3 professors here. Sitting, I leveraged on them. They did the theoretical framework, and I'm giving the recommendation. We have leveraged on Jigawa State. When Jigawa State, under the then Samunu Toraki, established Informatic Institute, people were laughing. This is a crazy man. But today, when you go to Kano GSM market corridor, most of the operators of that market were graduates of that institute. So it means Kano can continue to leverage on the effort of others, as Lagos is doing.
Please summarize
so
in 1 minute.
Finally, the end note, I'm ending. My end note is an adage I borrowed somewhere, which said, the best time to plant a tree was 6 years ago. And the next better time is now. If Kano had not committed itself to the pursuit of implement its plan. Lagos has gone ahead, and I was here 16 years to learn from them, and I have seen the transformation. I need not to be told. I was here, I saw it. So when we go back, we can still plant a tree in Kano tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mala Isa Ahmed, for sharing that perspective with us. I think you've done a very good analysis of the comparative advantages that both Kano and Lagos have, and what they can learn from one another in that regard. You almost opened the debate, which I think has been settled a long time ago, on whether to develop now and pursue democracy later. Meiji developed. Japan developed under Meiji. They developed under an authoritarian, more or less dictatorial context. Many of the Asian countries that Professor Pat Utome also mentioned developed under this bureaucratic authoritarian model with strong leaders and under undemocratic dispensation. That differs from our own context. We've commenced a transition to civil rule process, and we want to develop under that context, and we also want to ensure that our countries remain stable under that context, and we also want to make sure that the governance process operates democratically and also at the same time be efficient and clean and responsible and responsive to the needs and aspirations of the people. So I think it's very, very important in summary to recognize that no doubt in comparative terms, both Kano and Lagos are doing quite a lot, not just to transform their economies, but also to improve upon processes and structures of governance in order to do this. Of course, recognizing that development is linked to stability, and the stability is conditional on a good democratic governance process. But I think it's also important to recognize that neither Kano nor Lagos, nor the two of them together, can develop in isolation. So the key challenge is, while we are cognizant of these relative improvements that are going on, and they are commended and they should be encouraged, what can we think about improving the governance process nationally? And it's very, very important to address those issues. And I think in the discussions that we've had, a lot of these very good recommendations have come in. The need to use politics to change culture, the need to ensure that leaders pay attention to policy, the need to also, from my own perspective and from Professor Ademolokun's perspective, to also reform our electoral process so that people who are elected and who come into positions of responsibility will respect those who have voted for them and will also be responsive to the needs and aspirations. The governance process needs to be widened, needs to be inclusive, at the same time that we want it to be efficient and effective in the discharge of public goods and services. I think there is a lot to discuss. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to do that, but I will use the privilege of my chair to allow at least two 1-minute contributions or questions. I think it's important to do that, even though I'm told that lunch is very cold now. So let's take, if there are any people who want to make contributions, I will take 3 people. One from here. Yes, I will take you. Yes, from here. And from the other side, the Deputy Governor. Thank you very much. So starting from here. Please be very, very brief. 1 minute.
The moderator, the issue of reform, public service reform, which has been highlighted, especially by you, I think there are a lot of volumes of literatures with regard to the previous public service reforms that has been said. What I noted is that we don't have, or the governors do not have the will, the strong will to make sure that the public service work in such a way that it will benefit the society. For example, the appointment being made into the public service, the Constitution provided for who shall be the head of service. The Constitution provided for all those guidelines, even the Public Service Commission. So the entry and the exit of those public servants is there. Moreover, you will realize also that beside the definition of those entry and exit, because of lack of will to make sure that we allow our civil servant to operate based on the civil service rules, based on the manual of procedure, based on financial regulation, because as governors, executive governors, if you allow them to operate with those, those documents that have already been prepared, you will realize that the public service will be efficient. But if, and at any time the public service is made to be underdog, made to be, a running errand for political exigencies, then you realize that all these things we are saying may not really happen unless and until we make our civil servant to be according to the rules and the regulation. And also, you remember the Public Service Commission. If you politicalize it, you can never have the kind of public service that you require. In the same way, Office of the Head of Service, if you politicalize it, you may not have the real machinery, because civil servant or public servant are supposed to be the machinery for making the government work. Anybody anybody is put into work, and eventually it won't work. So my submission is this: let the government have the goodwill, have the will to make sure that as from today, our Public Service Commission is going to be independent, as provided by the Constitution. And also, the Office of the Head of Service should be independent, as provided by the Constitution. When you do that, then you have set the phase to move towards a good and effective Public Service Commission.
All right. Thank you very much for that contribution. I think there's somebody here I recognize. Yes, Professor.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Moderator and the discussant. I thought it's important for me to make two clarifications very quickly. When you have two entities that are willing to come together and to execute an important aspect of investment and economic issues, you do not expect the two agencies to be of equal strength. If they are of equal strength, then it doesn't become any meaningful for them to really collaborate. The last speaker, I think, have elaborately discussed about the potentials in Lagos, but I thought probably the potentials in Kano have been not well fully, been exposed and reported. For example, yes, in the area of education, yes, we may have some differences, but I do not see that as a real impediment that will not allow us to really kickstart an important process of this nature. Kano has a very, very important potential in the area of agriculture. While you can clearly describe the Lagos economy as infrastructure-based, you can as well very critically, assess Kano economy as an agriculture-based. And this gives two important areas of complementarity that will go a long way in supporting us. Kano has abundant land that has not been fully exploited. If we take the world map as a case, out of the 400 million hectares, only about 40 million hectares is currently being put into use all over the world, and particularly in Africa. Now, that gives you a very important landmark and a very important asset for you to really showcase. The water resource potential in Kano, the over 20 dams, these are things that can create employment for millions and millions of people. So, solid mineral issues. If you take that, this is an important area where the state have a lot of resources that are yet to be untapped. And I believe, citing the case of the Informatic Institute, and that is why the good governance play a critical role in what we really need to do. And good governance need to give an opportunity to look into today, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And if you take the case of the informatics school, with due apology, if certain things have not been come to the rescue, the project would have been in a serious difficulty and mess. For example, Kano University of Science and Technology is now that is actually the one that is taking care of all the informatic institute in Kazaure, and including the one in Kura. So really, some of these issues, good governance will clearly play a leading role in terms of what we really need to do, and we don't need to be of the same synergy for us to really forge ahead and come up with a very strong link and ties. And I believe the time is appropriate, and I believe the conditions are favorable on the basis of what I have said for greater collaborations to be executed between these two state governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I call upon the Deputy Governor of Kano. You wanted to make a comment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, lead and other discussants of this very important session, that is the governance session, which is, I think, key to any progress that we will make, particularly economic development. My own, Mr. Moderator, is just a question to all of you, with your permission. Certainly, we have identified at least two key deficits, and that is of very weak institutions and which has also given birth, especially at the political level, to an extremely weak, almost, I cannot even get a word to describe the recruitment process, which is really hampering us in this country from getting the quality leadership that we are yearning for to lead progress. So my question is, can you please just enumerate some very clear steps that need to be taken in building or resuscitating weak institutions, to strengthen institutions, maybe with some practical examples? And how do we really practically, change the recruitment process? Because to be honest, we are now captives. We are slaves. And to remove us from the grip of the bad elements that are actually in charge of the recruitment process is one of the biggest problems in this country. What steps, in clear terms, do we take to address these issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Ladies and gentlemen, we can't go on and on. Time is of essence. We've already taken so much time. But given the question that has been asked, I will give a minute to each of the panelists to see if we can address the concern that has been raised by the Deputy Governor, starting from Professor Pat Utomi.
Well, thank you so very much. Such a very important question asked. Unfortunately, I was going to get to all of that, but time, the usual. One of the things that I wanted to really hammer on was, and we call it reform or the public service. I don't want to use reform. It's a reprogramming, retraining of public servants to change their mindset. We need an entrepreneurial public service that sees its being as essentially promoting development and quality of life of people. A public service that understands that we need a partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and the social enterprise sector. And has that, the Malaysians do this so well. Again,
dey Lagos oyinbo. If I carry you go banana, my guy, you go love Lagos o. If I carry you go to Elegushi, you go love Lagos o. If I carry you go Niru, my guy, you go love Lagos. Sepe see the police, Governor Ambode Kofoshi, helicopter low for Loki. You cannot deny, you know see. Father Kérésì làwọn tèmi ṣá, ọmọ Kérésì wọlé bá, kó dùn kó pọ̀ kó pẹ́.
I mentioned in my own presentation, time did not permit for me to read every page, but I have captured what Kano has done.
All right, thank you very much. Prof, 1 minute, please.
Yes. I think we've mentioned Botswana, so many other countries, but we can also learn from our past. The public service in Western Nigeria, in Eastern Nigeria, in Northern Nigeria were strong institutions. Adebo, Udoji, Akilu. Let us go back to learn from the strong institutions we destroyed or we've left behind, which we do not have. We can learn from other countries, but we also need to learn from ourselves. I want to say that
most is the structure and reorganize the civil service. So it's important to begin to address these fundamental issues of restructuring and reorganization. There is no time to give more details, but I can tell you from my little experience, having been in the university and then suddenly I came to the Nigerian public sector as the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission. We came into a situation that we had an INEC that was expected to deliver its core mandate, which is delivering credible elections in 8 months, you know, and it was clear to us in 2 weeks in INEC that it lacked the capacity to be able to deliver with credibility. So it became evident that you have to restructure and to reorganize, and you can develop a framework, short, medium, long term, for restructuring and reorganization. Because really, no matter your vision, no matter how your willingness to invest, if you do not have institutions, public institutions that have people with competence, with capacity, with knowledge, and the selflessness to be able to deliver, then obviously they can truncate that vision and you can waste resources in the name of investment. For political will to pursue restructuring and the reorganization, you know, on a very, very organized and focused manner is very, very important, because you can remove redundancies, you can change orientation, you can follow that with a lot of training and retraining, and you can see value addition very easily if you do that. And you can also motivate, because if you restructure and you are able to remove people, because there are many people with cases of indiscipline, but they remain in the system because of the lack of political will to deal with them. So you can do it on the basis, very impartial, very professional, but it has to be done. And people for long will procrastinate in terms of really addressing the problem. Now, having said all that, I'm very sorry we've taken so much time, but I think it's been worthwhile. Governance is very, very important. And the reforming governance and making it good with quality to support stability and economic development is imperative. So we have to keep on looking for ways and the means of improving the quality of governance and the quality of government, because it's very, very important for stability, for progress, for development, and in particular for me, for addressing the fundamental needs and aspirations of the people. Again, we must realize that whatever we do has to be in the context of our democratic transition. We cannot say no. You know, we have to develop fast and forget about the democratic content of governance. Let's develop first and then we can democratize later. That argument has been put aside a long, long time ago. We must look at ways and the means of developing, at the same time addressing the fundamental needs and aspirations which are required in the democratic system that we operate. I think this is fundamental. So I would like to say thank you to the organizers for giving us as a panelist an opportunity to discuss this very important matter. I thank all the contributors. I apologize that we can't take more contributions, but I think it has been worthwhile. So let's give everybody a big round of applause, please.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for the panelists who are really qualified and certified eggheads. Professor Atahiru Jega, Professor Pat Utomi, Professor Ladipo Adamoleko, and of course, he protested. He said, no, why did you put me among all of these professors? But he's a very sound man himself, Alhaji Isa Ahmed, MNI. A round of applause for them. Thank you very much. Now, it's time for lunch, and I'd like to announce that the panelists don't get off yet. You will need to come with the governor. So this is how we're going to do it. The governor's here, the deputy governors, the speaker of the Kano State House of Assembly, all the discussants, both present and future, you know what I mean, right? And the CEOs and captains of commerce and industry will please go with the governor's entourage as they are leaving now. Then, members of the Executive Council of Lagos State and Kano State, and as well as all permanent secretaries from both states and all lawmakers from both states. This is where you're going for your lunch. It's at the main restaurant. Once you step out of the hall, turn to the right, there'll be protocol officers who will lead you. The rest of us who are participants, we're going to the hall that is immediately behind this one. Also, we'll go through that same door. So please enjoy your lunch, and we hope that we'll be back here in another 45 minutes. Lunch is of Your Excellencies. Panelists, please